first of all, how many of you have read Red Harvest? Okay, that's good. Most of you, great. So I can't like lie to you and tell you that it's a happy Christmas tale about bunny rabbits or something like that. So I want to start by providing some contexts for thinking about Red Harvest, and then I would like to hear what questions or thoughts you all have about the book as well, or about Dashiell Hammett. So as Catherine said, Dashiell Hammett was born in Maryland, and in fact he's buried nearby too. He's buried in Arlington. He was born in 1894 and died in 1961. And he left school when he was a teenager. He worked at various odd jobs at that point, and finally settled into being an operative for the Pinkerton Detective Agency, starting in about 1915, and he worked for them with a break for World War I, from 15 to about 1921. The Pinkerton Detective Agency, if you don't know, was a very large detective agency. It wasn't like one of those ones. It wasn't like a private eye kind of agency like you run into in the noir books, with just like one guy in a seedy office. It was a large operation, and it is actually from the Pinkertons that we get the term private eye, because their symbol was the unblinking eye. And so it came from that. He worked for them, did a lot of jobs tailing people, working on crimes. But eventually, as the teens wore on, the Pinkertons were employed more and more as strike breakers. So they would be called in when there was a strike to bust heads. So they, hi guys. So they, because of that, Hammett ultimately became disillusioned with working for the Pinkertons. He didn't think that was moral, and so he eventually left. By the time he left, he was not in good health. During World War I, he had contracted tuberculosis. He was already an alcoholic by this point and continued to be throughout his life. And in just a few years later, he would contract emphysema. So he was often in ill health throughout his life. He started writing pulp fiction in the early 20s. His first story was published in the magazine Black Mask in 1922. And then he had this very strange writing career. He wrote stories throughout the 20s, and then published his first novel, Red Harvest, in 1929. It was serialized in Black Mask before that in 1927-28. And he then published in very quick succession 4 novels. The other ones are The Dane Curse, The Maltese Falcon, The Glass Key, in that first burst of writing. He wrote those 4 novels all between 1927 and 1931. So 4 novels very quickly. Then he wrote The Thin Man a couple years later in 1934, and then nothing. Never published another thing after 1934. And as I said, he lived until 1961. No one actually has any answer to why that was the case. Writer's block, ill health, alcoholism, but he managed to do a number of other things he moved from San Francisco, where he had lived in the 20s, to New York City in 1929, and spent most of the 30s sort of moving back and forth between New York and Hollywood, where he was sometimes employed as a screenwriter along with a lot of other writers of the time. You probably know that people like F. Scott Fitzgerald and William Faulkner and Raymond Chandler were also employed in Hollywood. It was around this time that he met Lillian Hellman, who later became a quite well-known playwright. They fell in love. They were never married, but they had an ongoing relationship until he died. He was also a drinking buddy of William Faulkner's. Whenever the two of them found themselves together at a party or in Hollywood somewhere, it was a meeting of alcoholics, and they got along very well. I mention this because in a former life I was a Faulkner scholar, so this brings together those two things for me. In the 1930s, Hammett became gradually more and more active in socialist and communist causes. With the money that he was making from movie sales, he was contributing about $1,000 a year to the Communist Party. He became a leading figure in the Screenwriting Guild, organizing for recognition and for wages. He spoke at rallies for communism. He spoke against fascism, against racism and anti-Semitism. Became president of the Civil Rights Congress. When World War II began shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, he signed up to join the Army, and amazingly managed to get in, given the fact that he was, that he had tuberculosis and that he was a communist. But I guess he had friends who could get him in. But he spent the war editing a newspaper, so it wasn't like super hard duty. But it was in the Aleutian Islands, and I believe this is when he first contracted emphysema. In 1951, he was put in jail for 6 months for refusing to testify about his subversive alliances. And then in 1953, he was brought before the House Un-American Activities Committee. Both times he refused to answer questions. And unlike a lot of people from this time, he was quite unrepentant about his communist beliefs. He stood by them and never had any interest in recanting. I think those are some of the important facts about Hammett's biography. It's also useful when thinking about Hammett to think about this term hard-boiled fiction. I suspect you've probably run into this term somewhere before. Hard-boiled fiction describes a school of writing that was popular in the 20s, 30s, and the 40s. My students. They're not allowed to do that when I actually have class. And the hard-boiled school of writing is usually identified, these days at least, with three writers. Hammett, the first, James M. Cain, and who's the author of like The Postman Always Rings Twice, and Mildred Pierce, Double Indemnity, and then Raymond Chandler, the author of The Big Sleep, The Long Goodbye, the whole series of classic detective novels starring Philip Marlowe. And the hard-boiled school really begins with the pulps, right? That is to say, pulp fiction gets its name from the magazines in which it was published, And the reason they were called pulps is because the quality of the paper was that bad. It was pulpy, uneven paper. And there was a kind of a battle that went on for a while. There was competition between the pulps on the one hand and the slicks, and those were the slick, glossy magazines where they actually had nice paper that they were published on, and therefore they were held in contempt by the writers who wrote for the pulps. The most famous of the pulps was Black Mask, and this is the magazine where many writers got their start. It wasn't the first place that Hammett published, but it was the place where he published the most. And then it later became a jumping off point for all manner of other writers, including Chandler and Earl Stanley Gardner and that whole crew. And it's also, I think, useful when thinking about the hard-boiled school to see the way in which it is interested in differentiating itself from the literary fiction that is being published at the time. Because this, of course, the 20s and 30s, is the era of literary modernism. So it's the era when what is treated as literature are these quite difficult works by people like T.S. Eliot, Virginia Woolf, William Faulkner, James Joyce. If you have ever read anything by any of those authors, then you know that it's not the easiest reading you've ever come across. Modernism is difficult, self-consciously literary, and defines itself largely against the popular culture of the time. Whereas the hard-boiled fiction of the pulp writers has this interesting quality where they seem to hate literary modernism and the popular culture equally. And they have a kind of plague on both your houses philosophy, in which they try to set up a middle ground that is separate from either of those things and is not just the middle point of them either, that is not middlebrow. So the writers of this time and the pulp writers, the hard-boiled writers, are almost exclusively men. And so what they try to imagine for themselves is a literary space that is not about a kind of effete production of literary fiction, but which is the place where men can work as craftsmen. So they think of themselves almost as artisans rather than as cheap purveyors of popular fluff or effete producers of literary of literature held in contempt because it is insufficiently macho. So this in this space we find a number of writers grouped. The two writers who I think define what we think of as hard-boiled fiction, or what is sometimes called noir fiction, are really Hammett and Chandler. Has anyone here read any Raymond Chandler by any chance? Okay, a number. If you have read Chandler, then you'll know immediately what I'm talking about. If you haven't, you've probably run into some parodic version of Raymond Chandler somewhere along the line, whether it was in a Bugs Bunny cartoon or on a TV show or in another kind of movie, because his Philip Marlowe stories have really become iconic and representative of how we think about what is the hard-boiled school, what is detective fiction. and so one of the defining features of Chandler's fiction is that is the way he uses metaphor and simile. That is to say, he has these famously bizarre metaphors and similes that he uses. So a person, who is in the wrong neighborhood is described as standing out like a tarantula on a slice of angel food cake. Or General Sternwood in the Big Sleep, who is old and sick, is described as using his voice as carefully as an out-of-work showgirl uses her last good pair of stockings. So there is this kind of elaborate use of metaphor in Chandler, and kind of comical use of metaphor as well, right? We all, when we run into these metaphors, we all sort of like find them, so outrageous that they can be entertaining and therefore easily parodied. I just realized I forgot to put a timepiece up here. So at some point, oh wait, I've got a clock. Never mind. So I'll know if I'm like talking for too long. And Hammett, on the other hand, is far on the other side of the spectrum. There is almost no metaphor or simile in his works. Things are described in this very flat way that is unadorned, that is often kind of harsh and ugly, and in which nothing is ever compared to anything else. In Hammett, things are just things. Am I doing terrible things back there, by the way? Okay, all right. He's videotaping, so I'm afraid that I'm like doing something weird. Are you raising a hand or just like, okay. Sorry, teacher instincts. And so the other thing I wanted to say about the kind of cultural status of these hard-boiled writers is that the interesting thing is that although in their time they were considered to be pulp fiction, not to be high culture, now we get things like this, right? So we get these nicely bound books that look like they should sit on a sit in someone's private library somewhere, which I'm sure is where Julia keeps this book that I stole from her. Or we get these nice paperback versions, with the carefully designed covers, and Hammett and Chandler and the other hard-boiled writers are treated essentially as literature. So their cultural status has changed over time, to the point where you can get them in a series on books that shaped America. In the case of Hammett, maybe it should be like books that shaped America for better or worse. I feel like I had another thing I wanted to say and I've forgotten it. But in any case, if Red Harvest has shaped America, or shaped the world, then certainly one of the places where it has done this is in its cinematic afterlives. And there have been a remarkable number of films made that are based in some way on Red Harvest. It can be a little hard to tell sometimes whether it's just Red Harvest, because of Hammett's three great books, this one, The Maltese Falcon, and The Glass Key, they all share an essential structural similarity, right? They're all about central male characters who spend the book manipulating sides in some kind of larger war or conflict that is going on around them in order to achieve their ends. All three books do this. So it can be a little hard to separate out what's influencing what. But I wanted to say that one of the interesting things about the cinematic versions of this Hammett plot is that it crosses all kinds of genres in cinema. There was a straight adaptation of Red Harvest that was called Roadhouse Nights. Came out in 1930, which I have not seen. But then the better-known versions. In 1961, Akira Kurosawa made a film called Yojimbo, in which he takes the plot of Red Harvest, essentially, and makes it into a samurai movie. That was remade then as a Western by Sergio Leone, A Fistful of Dollars from 1964, in which another man with no name comes to a town and causes havoc. It was then later made as a gangster film, Last Man Standing from 1996. It was made as a fantasy movie in 1984 called The Warrior and the Sorceress. I have to admit, I also have not seen that one. And it was made as a high school film in 2005 called Brick. I don't know if anyone's seen Brick, but it's Dashiell Hammett set in a high school. And I wanted to mention that there are also the contemporary filmmakers who have shown the most interest in Hammett are the Coen brothers. Good timing, right? Their first film was called Blood Simple, a phrase that is taken directly from Red Harvest. And this film, Miller's Crossing from 1990, it takes elements from Red Harvest and The Glass Key and kind of mashes them up and makes them into this new plot. If you've seen Miller's Crossing, you may have noticed that the line that everybody says, that each character says to the others as a way of greeting is, "What's the rumpus?" which is also taken from Red Harvest, even though it's only used once in the book. So I wanted to just show one scene from the film, and it looks like I've even got it queued up, so great. This is a scene in which the character who here is standing in for the Continental Op is, and his name is Tom, played by Gabriel Byrne. He's a lot better looking than the Op is. He's having a meeting with one of the crime lords who runs this unnamed city that he lives in, and he's offered himself as a kind of advisor to this guy, but in fact, what he's doing is very much like what the Continental Op does, which is figuring out how to play everybody against everybody else so that they all destroy each other. So
is this from Miller's Crossing?
So this is from Miller's Crossing, yes.
Well, you're right. You're right. What?
All right.
You never say.
Crank up the volume a little bit.
Hold yourself.
So what am I right about?
I can't tell if we're going backwards or not. Yes.
You're right. But you never say I told you so.
So what am I right about?
Well, I'll tell you. But first, you gotta promise not to say I told you so.
I never say that, and I don't like people who do.
Mank was robbing me right along with the schmatter.
What convinced you of that?
Mank Leroy took a powder. We can't find him. The Dane is making excuses for him. But personally, I think he was right. I think that Mink and Barney was in it together. I think that Mink heard that you bumped the schmatter and lit out. Lousy son of a bitch.
I told you so.
What? You got a lip on you. It's all right. I don't generally care for it. That's all right. He was a good sport to bump the schmatter.
How do you know Mink skipped?
Because the Dane can't find him.
So he says.
Meaning what, exactly?
Maybe nothing. I didn't give it much thought until now, since a guy will pretty much say anything when his number is up, but just before I bumped Bernie, he swore to me that Eddie Dane and Mink were setting him up. They were the ones who sold out your fix.
Well, like you say, a guy will say anything.
So why isn't Eddie Dane here?
Well, he don't care for you, kid. Maybe it's only fair to tell you. After you left us, he tried to sell me on a double cross. He says to me, why don't we double cross you and give you the bump after we get the schmatter? Well, I figure a deal's a deal. You're square with me. You bump the schmatter, I hold up my end. Question of ethics. Everything above board. So everybody knows who's a friend, who's an enemy. So Dane doesn't like you, but he wouldn't cross me. We go back.
Of course, there's always that wild card when love is involved.
I know Mink is Eddie Dane's boy. Still, I don't make it that way.
And there's nothing to worry about.
Yeah.
Papa, I got a prize from the sister! Papa, I got a prize from the sister! Papa, I got a prize from the sister!
Yeah, just a minute. Of course, then there's no
Papa,
reason.
I got a prize!
Shut up! You take a page out of this guy's book. A little less you talk, a little more you think. Kids, you gotta be firm. Anyways, there's no reason not to check things out. If Mink is around, I want you to find him. He can tell us what's what. What's the matter? Somebody hit you? What's the matter? Aren't we friends anymore? If you find him, I want to talk to him alone. That's the way you get the straight dope, man to man. Just me, Mink, and my friend Roscoe. You understand what I'm saying?
It ain't complicated.
Okay. Thank you, Leanne. If we want, we can talk more about that at some point. I also wanted to read just a little excerpt from the movie, rather than showing the scene, which it seems to me speaks to the way in which it uses Hammett. And in this scene from the movie, Tom, the character we just saw, Gabriel Byrne, is in bed with Verna, who, it's complicated, but they're having an affair. And he says, "There's a dream I had once. I was walking in the woods, don't know why. The wind came up and blew my hat off." Verna says, "And you chased it, right? You ran and finally you caught up to it and picked it up, but it wasn't a hat anymore. It had changed into something else, something wonderful." And Tom says, "No, it stayed a hat." And that, it seems to me, is the impulse that we get very often in Hammett, is the impulse to resist allowing one thing to be represented as another thing, or to be transformed into another thing. Things are things in Hammett, and they're never anything other than what they are, because it's confusing enough even that way. Okay, so a couple of things. I apologize. I was going to write a list of the characters on the board before we started this, and I forgot. So sorry about that. There are a whole bunch of characters in the book, and it's easy to get them mixed up. But of course, the most important character is the main character, the detective, the Continental Op. So called because he is never given a name by Hammett. and because he is an operative for the Continental Detective Agency, which clearly is a stand-in for the Pinkertons. He was used by Hammett as the central character in 2 of his novels, this one and The Dane Curse, and in many of his stories. And so in a lot of ways, the Op is the original hard-boiled detective. He is tough, he is overweight, he's alcoholic. To judge by Red Harvest, his diet is extremely disturbing. It's hard not to be concerned about his health. And also smart. This is one other key thing to keep in mind about the hard-boiled detective school, is that it needs to be distinguished from the tradition of detective fiction that goes before, and that we're probably all most familiar with from Sherlock Holmes, from Arthur Conan Doyle. That is to say, the analytic tradition in detective fiction, which is largely, although not exclusively, English, is one in which we have detectives who solve crimes by thinking about them, and by looking closely at things. In the case of Sherlock Holmes, it's a tradition that most people think starts with Edgar Allan Poe, with his stories like The Purloined Letter and The Murders of the Rue Morgue. And Poe's detective, whose name is Dupin, is purely analytical in his processes. He solves mysteries while never ever leaving the room that he's sitting in, right? He solves mysteries by thinking them through rationally. In the case of Sherlock Holmes, we get a detective who goes out and and looks through his iconic magnifying glass, right? Because he looks at the details, and then he solves the mystery that way. In analytical detective fiction, we have some kind of crime that is committed, and then that crime is investigated by the detective, and then gets put back in a box, right? So the detective finds the criminal or criminals, and in the process of finding them, heals over the tear that has been made in the social fabric by this violation of the law. But in hard-boiled detective fiction, we get something very different. Something that is really more political. And in hard-boiled detective fiction, the detectives, for one thing, are much more likely to be getting into fist fights, which very rarely happens with, with Sherlock Holmes. Occasionally there'll be a scuffle, right? And that's about as violent as things get in Sherlock Holmes in his personal life. But in the hard-boiled novels, there are people with guns shooting each other. The detective is often getting beaten up. In fact, it's really not a hard-boiled detective novel until the detective has been beat up at least once, preferably knocked out and had some weird hallucinations. So the way in which crime is represented in these books is also different. The hard-boiled detective takes on a case. Maybe it's a murder. Usually it's a murder. Sometimes it might be something else, a kidnapping, say. And in the process of investigating that initial crime, discovers that it is linked to other kinds of crime. And this is what we get in Red Harvest, right, which begins with the death of Donald Wilson. But the death of Donald Wilson turns out to be connected to the corruption of Poisonville generally. There is almost always in hard-boiled detective fiction, and in the film noir that emerges from it, an investigation not only of a particular crime, but also of the society within which that crime has been allowed to exist and flourish. Let me just start then by reading the first paragraph of Red Harvest, and then I will offer not a true plot summary, because trying to summarize the whole plot of Red Harvest would get really, really complicated, and I would just get tied up in knots up here. But a very basic summary for those of you who haven't read the book. So, first paragraph. I first heard Personville called Poisonville by a red-haired mucker named Hickey Dewey in the big shop in Butte. He also called his shirt a shoit. I didn't think anything of what he'd done to the city's name. Later, I heard men who could manage their R's give it the same pronunciation. I still didn't see anything in it but the meaningless sort of humor that used to make Richardsonary the thieves' word for dictionary. A few years later, I went to Personville and learned better. So, the story of Red Harvest, this continental operative has been called to the city of Personville by a newspaper editor named Donald Wilson. He goes there, and shortly after his arrival, before he even meets him, this Donald Wilson is murdered. He very quickly learns that Personville is run by has at least in the past been run by this old guy named Elihu Wilson, who is the father of Donald Wilson, and that you know, in the process of breaking up some the strikes that were being held by his employees in the town, he's had to give some of his power to other other factions, other people in the town who have now become crime lords, bootleggers, gamblers of one sort or another. So the situation in Personville or Poisonville is that we've got several different crime factions who are all basically working together. Who are all, no one has absolute power, but they're all existing in a kind of tense harmony. And the op, who shortly after he's arrived, the chief of police has tried to have him killed at least once, maybe twice, decides that he doesn't like Poisonville. He's annoyed by Poisonville, and that he is going to do everything in his power to destroy it, and to destroy all the people who have power. And so, out of sheer meanness, he sets out to play the different factions against each other, and to get as many of them killed as possible. I think that's a reasonable summary of the book. And he succeeds, and then the book more or less ends with with Poisonville strewn with corpses and the op walking away. So I'm curious. Questions about any of this, or thoughts about any of this? Is there anything that you'd like to bring to the conversation, or why are you here? Why are you interested in what kind of person are you that you're interested in this book? I'd like to know, really. What's wrong with all of us? Yeah.
You say you have a former life as a Faulknerian scholar, and I know that to be true. One question I have is why you're no longer a Faulknerian scholar. What has changed in the literary canon? But if you were still,
I really am still a Faulkner scholar. Yeah. I'm just not publishing anything. So.
But so that the supply and demand at American University requires you to concentrate on what you're concentrating now. Then.
No, actually, honestly. It's not really supply and demand or the changes in the profession or anything. It's just me, being unable to focus on one thing for very long. So whenever I write a new book, I want it to be on something different.
So if you were still being Faulknerian, you probably would be talking about, as far as literary style, you'd be talking about Hemingway and Dos Passos as being emblematic of this kind of writing.
You mean comparable to
Yeah.
to the hard-boiled writers?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting, you know, that modernism is so, is often so much about the interior life, right? So modernist writers like Joyce and Faulkner and Woolf, are all interested in the rich interior life of of their characters, right? So that you can take, say, one day in Dublin as experienced by a few unremarkable people and make it into an epic novel. Hammett is obviously the opposite of that, right? He strips interiority out of his books and gives us no information, even in a first-person narrated novel like this, about what's going on in his characters' inner lives. So within the world of modernism, yeah, probably the people we would go to would be someone like Hemingway, who we know is, has a much more spare style than someone like Faulkner or Woolf, or to Dos Passos, who does his kind of experiments in a kind of a quasi-journalistic mode. Is that why you're thinking of
Well,
those
I
guys?
guess what I'm asking is, would it be more appropriate to say that Hemingway and Dos Passos have shaped America rather than Hammett?
I don't know. It would be more accurate because they have been more widely read. You mean?
Yeah.
Maybe. But I think that we can. I don't want to make an argument for Dashiell Hammett having shaped America. But what I would argue is that Hammett exists in the same world as these modernist writers more than one might think at first glance. That is to say that his writing is actually unusual, and it seems to me that it encourages us to ask the same kinds of questions that we ask when we read Hemingway or read Faulkner. As in, why is this written this way? What is the choice that's being made in terms of how this book is written? I'm curious. Were people in reading the book struck by the writing of it? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it, a couple of times, it made me sort of laugh because it reminded me of, as a kid, watching Dragnet.
Just the facts.
And, yeah, just the facts. Not, there's no personal development of the character. It's just, here he is, just doing this, or pursuing this. And so it's always cut to the chase, very succinct, and how can I use this to figure out what's happening over here?
Mm-hmm.
So-
Although with the opposite politics, right?
Well, yes,
With
yeah,
with
different-
Dragnet being very right wing.
Very right wing,
Yeah.
but in a sense, I could see where all these other characters we then have seen in movies and other kinds of detective fiction have come from. So I saw that as why that might be on the list of the books that shaped America, because it clearly shaped a whole path.
That terse
for-
style.
Yes. And a anti-hero, hero where you know little about him, and you don't really care that you don't know much about him. He's not somebody you're engaged by personally. He's just there to move the plot along.
That's right. We have no emotional connection to the op at all, right?
You really didn't care. You're sort of reminded every now and then of how little he cares, because people he's involved with, connected to, he wakes up, he may have killed this woman, he may not. He doesn't seem to be bothered particularly by the fact that she's dead, and that he was there when it happened or perpetrated the crime. It's just so it's a very cold edged character, more than we've had, I think, in a lot of
Yeah,
ways.
a cold character, and described in a cold way.
Yeah.
the language echoes that. Yeah, you had that.
Well, in terms of Hamlet's influence on American culture, I think a lot of it was really from the films that he made, or the films that were made from his work, because those were very iconic films at a time when films were a very iconic part of American entertainment. Nick and Nora Charles, even the dog.
Asta.
Asta, right. And I'm wondering if you could speak to the fact that he may have felt represented artistically by those films and also compensated handsomely and felt no need to do anything else, and really, I'm assuming that he made enough money from those films that he was able to give the $1,000 a year to the Communist Party and do the things that he did. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely the case that as you say, The Thin Man and its sequels were enormously popular and made Hammett a lot of money. He made money from book sales and from script sales as well. But I don't think that's the reason why he didn't write anymore. My sense is that he really would have been happier if he had been publishing. Not that he was just sitting, all right, now I can sit around and eat bonbons and drink champagne. It was, my sense is that he was bitter, actually, about not being productive, as writers generally are. And that, as with, like Faulkner, for instance, he was one of these people who drank, to wild excess when he was not writing. When he was writing, he was entirely focused on the process of producing the book, and then it would be when he didn't have anything to do that he would go on a real bender, and basically he just went on a bender for the last 25 years of his life. And made himself and Lillian Hellman totally miserable as a result. He and Lillian Hellman made each other miserable. They were both drinking a lot. They were both having affairs with other people. So there was a lot of drama there.
So in this edition, they state something that would seem to bridge the gap somewhat. It says 1935, Dashiell Hammett meets Gertrude Stein, who greatly admires his works.
Uh-huh.
Is there any more known about what she thought about his work? Did she just go, wow, yeah, great novel, or did she admire the style and the art of it?
That's a good question. I don't know anything about what Gertrude Stein's interactions with Hammett. But it would make sense, right? Because she was a friend of Hemingway's, and admired what he was doing, and there is a lot of crossover between Hemingway and Hammett, what they do, and also Stein very famously loved detective stories. In fact, she wrote an essay called "Why I Love Detective Stories," and she wrote a ridiculously experimental detective story called I think "Blood on the Dining Room Floor." Did I get that right? You looked like you were nodding. Which I have not read in a long time, but as I recall, there was no mystery about it whatsoever, and it was all about just Gertrude Stein doing her thing. Yeah.
Two different thoughts. One is about the book we were talking about his style. I don't think it's only that it's a narrative that moves along. I actually found it fascinating, even though they're hard-boiled, cold people, about their dialogue and the back and forth. The sarcasm, interrupting each other, the style. There was something that is very, to me, American in terms of the 20s and 30s.
Yeah.
James Cagney type and all those people. It feels like his style was very entertaining. How the people beat up on each other, and he was always tougher than whoever he was talking to. But I really liked that, and the nicknames they gave people. But the other thing about his not writing, I'm just wondering if he was so political and and so concerned, plus drinking so much maybe to block things out, that I think it would be hard to write books that are this divorced from the world in terms of what was going on in the late 30s with Hitler and communism and with all the things that were going on. If he was actually plugged into those concerns, I would think it would be really, he would require to completely disconnect himself from the world in order to write this kind of stuff, because it's completely unrelated to anything that's happening that is
Right.
meaningful. It's a non-meaningful book. And he had meaningful concerns. I mean, even in this book, he begins with talking about the guy with the red tie and the IWW,
Yeah, that's right.
which, nobody knows about the IWW.
Well, I hope someone still knows about the Wobblies.
Cover the world.
And well, what's that?
Cover the world.
And yeah, so see, we're all acquainted with the Wobblies in this room. I mean, so those are two like really rich things. The first one, is the question about dialogue. So much of the energy and of these texts, both in hard-boiled fiction and in film noir, comes from that particular sort of dialogue, and which is both both very tough and yet also entertaining. Right? We like it because there's this kind of like verbal snappiness to it. I mean, as you say, the phrases that Hammett uses are often very memorable. Like what's the rumpus? And also it's about that back and forth in which often what you're watching is is two characters basically kind of like slapping each other on the face, going back and forth. It's like, I slap you, you slap me back, I slap you, and the so that the violence of the books often comes as much from the way that people talk to each other as it does from what they do to each other. I mean, in Red Harvest, they do some really horrible things to each other physically too, but the but that quality of the dialogue is it really is about like proving that you're tougher because you can say something tougher rather than that you can pull a bigger gun or something like that. Yeah.
You mentioned, which I had.
And I'm going to come back to the second question at some point here.
I don't mean to cut it off.
Yeah.
You had mentioned, which I hadn't known, that it was originally published in serialized form.
Yeah. All his novels except The Thin Man were in fact serialized in Black Mask.
Now, did he write it and then break it up for serialization, or was he doing it because it seems like he's constantly, for the next installation, we've got new characters thrown in, we've got new plot
Right.
twists. I could sort of see every week or every month, whatever it's coming out, it's like, oh my gosh, this is going in a whole new way than the last chapter.
Yeah. I mean, I was saying to Julia before the talk started that it's like at the point when Charles Proctor Dawn shows up late in the book, I was just like, really, we need another plot complication at this juncture, and no, I think he did write them like section by section, especially because he was writing them so fast. There wouldn't have been time for him to like prepare a whole novel and then like break it up for the serialization. My knowledge of Hammett's biography is imperfect, but that is, my sense is I don't see how he could have possibly done it that way.
Because you see a character that you think is going to be important, and then they're gone, kind of. They sort of fade away, and somebody else entirely new is suddenly.
That's right. And so in other words, it does seem like a serialized book in a lot of ways. One other thought that I had, by the way, about this question of dialogue is that there's an interesting parallel to be drawn between the kind of dialogue that you get in hard-boiled novels and in film noir, and the kind of dialogue that you get in a very different kind of genre, which is to say the screwball comedy in the 1930s and 40s. So that is to say, these are both forms that are all about that back and forth. In the screwball comedy, it's always a kind of battle of the sexes. We're really in love with each other, kind of thing. Beatrice and Benedict from Shakespeare, that sort of relationship, where it's all about, where it's all about a man and a woman, doing this kind of playful slapping of each other, whereas it's done in a more serious mode in the hard-boiled form. But the structure of the dialogue is often more or less the same, interestingly enough. I wanted to jump on the second question about the meaningfulness of the book. Is it a book that has meaning outside of itself, or is it just a kind of like exercise in just an exercise in what it does, an exercise in tough guy talk and violent action? I'm wondering to start with about this question of Personville and Poisonville. Now, I'm a literary critic, and when you see something like that, and it's the first line of a book, then your literary critic instincts tell you that that's not innocent. That it's not just the same thing as calling a shirt a shoit, but that there is some kind of analogy that's being drawn between person and poison. So I'm wondering, do we get that in this book? Does that do we see that play out? That people are poison?
Well, it does seem like the whole town is corrupt.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. We certainly don't meet any do we meet any characters who are like nice? Who we like? The Wobblies.
The opposite of
The opposite. That's right. So that's the other strange thing about it. Like if we know about Hammett that he has these kind of that he has these socialist beliefs, that he and he is really deeply committed to the idea of like brotherhood, of like people, banding together and being stronger because they band together than an individual. Then why isn't Bill Quint, the labor organizer who he meets right at the beginning of the book, why isn't Bill Quint the hero of this book? I mean, this is like the era when there are books like that being written, right? There are proletarian novels that are being written, particularly in the 1930s, a little later, in which what we get is like the heroism of labor, and we get proletarian heroes. But Hammett very definitely doesn't give us that, right? I mean,
He's making more the point that this whole community is so poisoned that his goal is to bring in the National Guard. He could have become corrupt, our Continental we don't know much about, and yet he has the opportunity to participate. He's offered opportunities to become rich off of buying into the corruption, but his goal seems to be to bring it all crashing down, leave it in the hands, and then he sort of leaves going, now it has a chance to start over. Mm-hmm. As if it just took pruning all of this away. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what his ultimate point was, but it was kind of odd.
Well,
it is, I agree, yeah.
I think it reminds me of Sodom and Gomorrah. This place is going to be wiped off, or at least the most of the people. And it also made me feel as though the Eden of the book is San Francisco. That's where we're going to go back to. But
I can relate to that.
Mining town in the mountains, is just terrible. His only buddies, or at least one of them, are his coworkers in the agency that he can call on.
And one of them gets so
turns on him.
Since he's
event winds up not trusting him,
Yeah, yeah,
feeling like
yeah.
he's been poisoned by Poisonville.
Yeah.
Right. So in other words, it's like it's this world in which no one can trust anyone else. It's very maybe then we could think of it as as the flip side of the labor as hero narrative, the flip side of the proletarian hero story, right? So instead, what we get is like the dystopian vision of like what the world is like under capitalism. So and the world under capitalism means everybody is radically disconnected from everybody else. Every person is only a person, right? Personville, Poisonville, and the and so we get this disconnection, right? Radical individualism as total dystopia. And when that and one of the other things along those lines that we get in the book is money elevated to the power of everything, right? Money is the thing that motivates every person in the book. Everything and everybody in the book can be bought. And along those lines, the soul of the book the soul of the town in some sense is Dinah Brand, right? Because she's the one who wants everything. I'm sorry, my mic has come undone. Do I just clip this back on, or?
Oh God, I'm gonna use the automatic.
So should I take it off then?
Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. Thinking about Dinah Brand. No, I don't want that passage. I want the other one. If you're following along in your books, this is on pages 34, 35. All right, so I'll pick up with, this is a conversation between Dinah and the op, and she says, "What are you trying to do? Learn who killed him, not who could have or might have, but who did. I could give you some help," she said, "but there'd have to be something in it for me." "Safety," I reminded her, but she shook her head. "I mean, it would have to get me something in a financial way. It'd be worth something to you, and you ought to pay something, even if not a fortune." "Can't be done," I grinned at her. "Forget the bankroll and go in for charity. Pretend I'm Bill Quint." At this point, Dan Rolfe starts up from his chair, lifts his wife to the rest of his face. He sits down again. She laughs, a lazy, good-natured laugh. "He thinks I didn't make any profit out of Bill, Dan." She leaned over and put a hand on my knee. "Suppose you knew, far enough ahead, that a company's employees were going to strike, and when, and then far enough ahead when they were going to call the strike off. Could you take that info and some capital to the stock market and do yourself some good playing with the company's stock? You bet you could," she wound up triumphantly. "So don't go around thinking that Bill didn't pay his way." All right, so I take this as a representative conversation with Dinah Brand, who insists that every single relationship she has with everybody has to be an economic transaction. It has to be about exchange, and so we have a situation in which everybody is an individual actor, and everybody is working for money. Everybody is trying to get more money than they give. Everybody's trying to get the best of every transaction, and the result is that we have a town where there are no values whatsoever. There is no honesty, no trust, no value placed on human life. The only value is money. Yeah.
So that's what you mean, though. When you say she's the soul of the town,
Mm-hmm.
you mean that it's a mercenary soul.
Yes. Yes.
That's the essence of the town.
Yeah. Do you buy that? Okay.
But I think your point you made earlier is biographical, which I didn't know about his relationship to the Pinkertons. You could make the case that he's also writing an exaggerated grotesque of the criminality of strikebreakers.
Mm-hmm.
And that those were the people who he got disillusioned with, and that's why he left the Pinkertons.
Mm-hmm.
And that this is what happens when strikebreakers run amok, and they become connected to mafia and crime.
Mm-hmm. So if that's the case, then what do you do with the fact that the op is working for the Continental Detective
Well,
Agency?
they're a new detective agency.
Oh, they're different. They're better.
They're better. This is a different one.
Uh-huh.
I don't know. I just
Yeah.
the thought.
Yeah. No, I think that's right on some level.
problem he has within himself with people who were brought in to stop a strike, and they end up taking over.
Because that is where the troubles start in
Right.
Personville. We begin his entry into the town is he first meets Bill Quint, and Quint gives him the kind of like
You could say it's,
history.
this is too extreme, but it's the cautionary tale of what happens when there are no unions.
Right. That's right. So I mean, and within this model, if we buy this argument I'm making that the book is a kind of like is a portrayal of capitalist America as dystopia, then I guess the question would be, what do we do with the op? How do we account for him? Because he is, in fact, the one character in the book who is not motivated by money.
To that extent, he's incorruptible. I mean, he's not a good person in the sense that he does terrible things to achieve that goal, but he's not corruptible in his mission. He set his goal and that's it.
Right. It's not an especially noble mission.
No. I mean, you can stretch it to say, yes, he's trying to purge or find out the truth, blah, blah, blah. But, yeah, I mean, he sacrifices a lot of people along the way, knowing they're going to get killed, setting them up to be killed.
Right. I can't remember if I marked that passage. Might be on 64. Let's see. This is the moment when he sets out his mission, and this is page 64, where he says, "Your fat chief of police tried to assassinate me last night. I don't like that. I'm just mean enough to want to ruin him for it. Now I'm going to have my fun. I've got..."